Hey, welcome back everyone. This is episode 32 of the England series. So, in the last episode, we left Prince Rupert just after he saved the city of Newark from siege, and he's heading to rescue York. The news of his march sent a ripple of concern through the twisted string of allied Roundheads and Covenanters encircling the city. Alexander Leslie, the head commander of the northern fighting, didn't like how matters stood. He was no stranger to Rupert's fiery nature, and he knew their army was way too spread out to oppose one of those blazing charges for which the prince was so famous. Taking York would have to wait until they dealt with this new threat. Most of their forces were quickly pulled together and ranged on Marston Moor in an attempt to cut Rupert's journey short. And, in case you don't know, a moor is a big open plot of land that hasn't been farmed or settled. Usually it has hills, and tall grasses and shrubby vegetation like heather growing in it. This here is actually a picture of Marston Moor today. But things have changed a bit in the last 380 years or so. This here would be a perfect example of what a moor is. Anyway, Leslie's got his forces ranged up on this moor, trying to block Rupert. But Rupert simply brushed his forces aside like another little pesky summer's fly. He took a sharp turn, went completely around them, burst through a line of defenses guarding a boat bridge, and just like that, he saved York. Well, sort of saved York. That little fly was still sitting quietly there in Marston Moor, refusing to go away. And perhaps it wasn't so little as it had seemed. Leslie had more than 24,000 men under his command. Rupert had full 7,000 less than this. It must have seemed little to Rupert's big eyes, though, for he intended to squash it. Charles's instructions had been to put down the rebellion in the north, and God help him, put it down he would. "Gather your men," the prince told William Cavendish, the royalist general he had just saved. "We will do battle." But Cavendish wasn't so sure. He saw the fly for what it was, a dragon, and he didn't really think they were prepared to deal with a dragon. Especially now. The long weeks of being trapped in York had not helped the attitude of his troops. Many of them were out plundering the baggage left around the walls by their treating Roundheads, while others were nearing a state of outright mutiny. And to top it off, Cavendish had a very flustered Lord Eythin digging in his heels and protesting very loudly against Rupert's idea. Eythin had known Rupert for years. They had fought together back in the 30 Years' War. But familiarity doesn't make for friendship. He and Rupert hated each other from the first, and the 6 years since their last battle in Europe hadn't changed anything. Together, Cavendish and Eythin made up a very good-sounding excuse that they were much too busy at the moment. They said they must first clear away the rubble they had used to block the city gates during the siege. Rupert didn't have time to stay and haggle. He needed to move. He left the moor to meet the fly with the force he already had. Cavendish panicked. He couldn't just leave the prince to face the dragon alone. After a few desperate appeals, Cavendish finally managed to rally a small band of volunteers behind him, and then galloped frantically after Rupert. The prince greeted the repentant general cheerfully. "My lord, I wish you had come sooner with your forces, but I hope we shall soon yet have a glorious day." Of all things, the prince desperately wanted to launch a surprise attack. It was not a bad plan. It's actually quite a logical thing to do when your enemy is bigger than you are. But it was impossible. His footmen were exhausted. They had just got done with scrambling over the Pennine Mountains to get here, before dashing in to save York. They simply didn't have the energy to move fast enough for a surprise attack. Perhaps Rupert could have done it with the infantry from York, but they weren't here, so there was no use wishing on something that didn't exist. It must have been nonetheless infuriating, for there couldn't have been a better opportunity for a surprise attack. Leslie was having a bit of a time getting himself in order. He had deployed a bunch of men further north, thinking the prince was going to go that way next. He was rather surprised and a bit caught off guard then when he realized Rupert was coming straight for him. The troop was hastily recalled and was even now rushing back to build up the ranks. Precious minutes, hours even, of golden opportunity went to perfect waste as Rupert watched helplessly from his side of the moor. The clock had struck 2 before the battle opened, with the usual cannonade. The deadly hailstorm dragged on for 2 hours. And who should come up now but Lord Eythin, with the long-desired York infantry. Come too late to be of any real help. Actually, it would seem he came just to cause trouble. The first thing he did was to start bickering with Rupert. He said the prince had drawn his battle lines entirely too close to the enemy, and that he should draw back immediately. Rupert didn't think they were close enough. He and the Lord went round and round again until finally Rupert reached the limit of exasperation. Fine, you make the choice. We draw back as you say, or else we charge. Night was coming on fast. They needed to either truly join battle or call it off. Lord Eythin was impeccable. He said they could do neither. He said it was too late in the day to do anything now, and the troops should just lay down their arms and camp where they stood. And so they did. It had been a long day, and Rupert seemed to have run out of energy for arguing with his flustered elder officers. The spitting mist that had been flying in their faces on and off all day hadn't helped to raise his spirits either. But the fly was watching. Leslie smiled as he watched the line of royalist troops dissolve and settle down to supper. This was a chance he had been waiting for. "Charge!" the Scottish general cried. "On them now, lads!" Almost at the same moment, the threatening gloomy clouds finally broke out into a full-scale thunderstorm. Chaos struck Prince Rupert's army like a lightning bolt. Orders were hastily given. Some were obeyed, others not. Some men tried to hold their ground, others fled, and still others rushed to meet the charge. This wild mess fought out in the midst of the thunderstorm was the biggest battle of this English Civil War. One wing of Rupert's army actually somehow succeeded in demolishing one of Leslie's wings. Lord Fairfax himself was almost captured in that part of the fight. He had been caught up in the rush and found himself surrounded in a sea of enemies and cut off from his friends. Fairfax hastily tore the Roundhead badge off his hat. Lucky for him, everyone was way too confused in the rain and dark to notice him much. He managed to slip away and find Cromwell in another part of the moor. Cromwell's Ironsides were always in the thick of the conflict, and due to their aid, the little ground Rupert had gained was turned to nothing. Cromwell left the field only once that night, to have a wound from a pistol ball in his neck tended to. But then he quickly remounted and charged right back into the battle. He and his regiment had won their nickname in more ways than one. Oliver Cromwell was a man of iron. After a few hours of reckless fighting, the prince and what was left of his men were forced to flee the moor. Cavendish had been right. The fly was a dragon, and now Rupert knew it. He came very close to being captured that night, though he did not get off quite so easily as Fairfax had. Rupert was forced to lie down in a muddy bean field to hide from the Roundheads that were chasing him. Somehow, it seemed as if that sticky mud went right through his clothes, all the way to his very heart. This was the most humiliating thing that had ever happened in his whole life. He had never suffered a defeat before. Rupert never quite recovered from the Battle of Marston Moor. The memories of that night would trouble him for the rest of his life.